All right. Yeah, so I'm Tom. I'm presenting on the influence of anthrophony on the use of wildlife crossing structures in Texas. So as anybody who was at the plenary today, Ben was saying that he's really interested in road noise. Here we go, road noise. This is an ocelot here, but unfortunately, we're talking about everybody's favorite cat, the possum, and not cats. But here we are. So let's start off. We know there are many sources of sound in the environment, from wind and rivers, which make up the geophony, to biological noises, which make up the biophony, and then human-produced sounds or anthropogenic sounds, which is the anthrophony. Now, the anthrophony is often considered to be negative from a biological perspective. So we often consider this to be noise or undesired sounds. Now, there are a variety of sources of anthropogenic noise in the environment, but one of the most prominent ones is vehicle noise on roads. Now, previous research has shown that this noise can have profound impacts on wildlife, including altering animal vocalizations, changes in behavior, including avoidance in space and time of these noisy areas, as well as increased stress while exposed to noises. Now, additionally, as I'm sure we all know here, one of the main mitigation methods for roads is wildlife crossings, or WCS for short. Yet we really don't know that much about how noise interacts with wildlife crossings, how it moves through wildlife crossings, and then how animals respond to those changes in noise at crossings. So this noise factor could be really important in determining wildlife crossing effectiveness, especially at fine spatial and temporal scales. So the objectives for this study were to, one, assess differences in anthropogenic noise at wildlife crossings, including how noise varies along roads versus outside the crossing versus inside the crossing, as well as then assess how anthropogenic noise impacts the time an opossum spent at a crossing, as well as their probability of successfully using that crossing. Now, we used opossums in this study because they're really common in our study area in South Texas. We know they're disturbance tolerant. They use crossings a lot. And therefore, they make for an interesting study species to determine what is almost effectively the minimum possible impact of road noise on wildlife crossing use for mammals, at least. So our study area, I've alluded to it a little bit, was Farm to Market Road 1847 in Cameron County, Texas. So right down near the border, where 5 wildlife crossings are being built or were built on that highway between 2020 and 2022. They were built for ocelots, so they were built for cats. But they've been continuously monitored with camera traps since 2019. Now, to address our first objective, to assess how noise propagates through wildlife crossings, we set up 6 audio moth acoustic recording units, or ARUs, at different positions around each of our 5 wildlife crossings. So 2 were set at grade on the road, 1 on each side of the highway, 2 at the crossing entrances facing outwards, and 2 in the middle of the wildlife crossings. The devices were programmed to record continuously for about a month. We did run into a number of issues with those devices, as summer humidity and heat in South Texas and audio moths do not mix. Don't try it. Additionally, because we know that temperature and humidity impact how sound moves through the environment, we also set up temperature and humidity data loggers at each of our stations that we had our audio moths. Now, for a second objective and to address these issues that we had with the audio moths, we set up a Frontier Labs solar bar, a single unit at each of our wildlife crossings to record vehicle noise at our crossings and to pair this with our camera traps. So we already had our camera traps out and we coupled these our acoustic recorders with our camera traps. And we also had another temperature and humidity data logger out there because we know that that's important. So for our methods, opossums are fun. They make for great photos. We measured 2 indices of the anthrophony. The first was sound pressure level, or SPL, which measures the loudness of a recording. So basically just how loud was it? Was it really loud? Was it quiet? And that's measured in decibels. And then our second metric was the normalized difference soundscape index, or NDSI, which measures the relative amounts of biophony to anthrophony in a recording. So typically lower frequency sounds are anthropogenic in nature, higher frequency sounds are biological. So the ratio between those is the NDSI. And from that, we can determine how much of that noise was, or how much of that sound was anthropogenic versus biological. Just for reference, as we go through our results eventually, large values of sound pressure level means that there was louder. So most likely that means more vehicle noise, because vehicles are really loud compared to biological noise. Whereas small values of NDSI indicates more anthropogenic noise. So starting with our first objective, we found that crossings 1 and 2 were our loudest wildlife crossings. So that's the blue and the red on the top there, followed by crossing 3, and then crossings 4 and 5. Additionally, we found that there was much less noise at our wildlife crossing entrances and at our in the middle of our crossings compared to our road surfaces. So I forgot to mention this, but all of our crossings are underpasses, so they all go under the road, and all of these crossings are below grade. So there is clearly a difference between sound on the road and sound below the road, which is a good thing. Now, going back to our loudest wildlife crossings, crossings 1 and 2, these two had some very different characteristics. So crossing 1 was actually our smallest wildlife crossing, but was in the area with the highest vehicle traffic. So it had about twice the amount of traffic that our other 4 crossings had, at least based on average annual daily traffic. Whereas crossing 2, this was our largest crossing, but it had the same traffic as crossings 3, 4, and 5. Now the difference, crossing 3 had the least amount of vegetation around it, so the least amount of interference to prevent sound from getting from one place to another. Vegetation is a great blocker of sound. So let's keep that in mind. One last thing. We also found that the source of the noise, so that's these bottom graphs here, not very different between all of our wildlife crossings. So there's no real distinction between biological noise and anthropogenic noise at any of our wildlife crossings. So structurally, the sound characteristics are the same, just different levels of sound. So some are louder, some are quieter. And that means that this most likely related to vehicles are creating more noise, or the size of the structure is allowing more noise to get in. Now, when we start to look at the time that an opossum spent at a crossing, we found that opossums generally spend more time at crossings when it's quieter, but they also seems like when there's a single source of really loud noise, they might stay longer waiting for, say, a car, for example, to go by before they actually either leave the area or use the crossing. Now, we've also found that when opossums spend more time at wildlife crossings, how loud it was when they were there doesn't actually have that much of an impact on whether or not they successfully cross. So when opossums spend more time at crossings, they're more likely to successfully cross through the crossing. So quieter crossings, they spend more time at, and this means that they're more likely to actually cross. Therefore, we can say that opossums most likely, at least here in our study area, prefer quieter crossings, which kind of makes sense. Quieter crossings, less disturbance, more likely to actually use. It also seems like opossums, at least, are willing to wait for the noise to subside. So if there's a few cars that go by, they're willing to wait a bit before actually going through that crossing. And therefore, crossings that are in higher traffic areas, like our crossing 1, or crossings that are larger, which produce more sound, may actually be detrimental for crossing use, which is a weird thing for all of us to say, because typically larger crossings are better. But in this case, we're finding that larger crossings might produce more sound, which may actually be detrimental from a crossing perspective. So crossings should be large enough, obviously, for our target species, whether it's ocelots or opossums or deer or elk or something, but they should also be small enough to reduce the anthropogenic noise impact on wildlife. All right. There are still cats in this presentation. So because these crossings were built for ocelots, while we didn't actually measure the impact of anthrophony on more sensitive species than opossums, we do know that opossums, which are very tolerant of humans, it's therefore likely that more sensitive species such as bobcats or ocelots are also going to be negatively affected by vehicle noise. For example, this is an ocelot here at one of our wildlife crossings. This is our crossing 2, that really big crossing. And we did detect one ocelot at that location, but we also saw it approach the crossing and turn away. Unfortunately, we didn't have our acoustic devices out at that time, so we don't know how loud it was while that ocelot was there, but it's possible that maybe it got scared off by vehicle noise or something like that. We don't actually know. So just some final thoughts and future directions. So some of my current work, we're using anonymized smartphone locations or human mobility data to begin to look at how fine-scale patterns of human movement across landscapes, including recreation and on roads. And this could actually be a really great tool to also look at fine-scale impacts on wildlife crossing use. So we'd be able to know exactly, well, not exactly, but approximately relatively how many people are going across a road at a particular time. For example, if we pair that with cameras that are monitoring crossings or GPS data where we know where the animal is, we can know how many people that those animals might be interacting with, and therefore how that interaction at that time might be impacting crossing use. So we've done a lot of work at like broader scales where we kind of know generally, okay, this road has more traffic, this road has less traffic, it gets this use. But now we can actually say, okay, on this single road, when there is more or less traffic, how are animals interacting with those crossings? We're still just starting to explore and play with this data. And we're really open to collaboration and working with anybody who's interested. So if you're interested in working on any of this work, come find me at the conference, or my email address is coming up right now. It's right there. So if you want to contact me and talk about this or anything that I did for this presentation, happy to talk. And with that, I'd like to thank Texas Department of Transportation for funding all of this work, as well as the Cesar Kleberg Wildlife Research Institute at Texas A&M Kingsville for supporting my PhD research. And a bunch of collaborators helped with processing acoustic data, processing camera data, all of that. And hopefully there's probably plenty of time for questions. So here we go. I think we're also the last talk of this session. So yeah, we got 7 minutes.
Ocelots being like forest growth specialists, do these crossing locations have good habitat for ocelots?
That's a good question. So the question was, are these wildlife crossings in good habitat for ocelots? We know ocelots are they really like cover. In South Texas, they use thorn scrub primarily because there's no other sources of cover. And some of our crossings are in great ocelot habitat. But there's, in the study area that we're working in, there are an estimated, about 20 ocelots, I think. It kind of changes from year to year. So there's really not that many ocelots in the study area, and most of them are a little bit north of where all the wildlife crossings are getting put in, because that's a national wildlife refuge, and most of the ocelots are on the refuge, and then they have to cross 2 roads before they get to where our wildlife crossings are. One of those roads does have crossings, and those are used regularly by ocelots. But generally, the crossings in our study area have some good habitat, but some not so great habitat. But we do occasionally detect them on cameras. We had that one detection. So, I don't know if that answered your question.
Well, the question was more like, how does forest growth affect sound travel?
Yeah, that's a great question. So just based on comparing, we didn't actually specifically look at how sound travels through thorn scrub. But so our crossing, if we compare our crossing 3 to our crossings 4 and 5, there's a lot more thorn scrub-like vegetation near crossings 4 and 5 compared to 3, which is very open. And 3 was much louder than crossings 4 and 5. So my assumption would be that the thorn scrub would really reduce the amount of noise. And just if you crawl into the thorn scrub near a road, there's a lot less noise in there than there is in a more open area at the same distance from a road. So I would say that thorn scrub reduces noise significantly. So it's really important.
So you were talking about how opossums can spend more or less, opossums can spend more or less time in the crossing structures. If you look at what they were doing when they were in the crossing structure, was there any difference in their behaviors in the high moves or low moves?
So we didn't. Oh yes, the question was about whether there's a difference in behavior of opossums in high noise versus low noise. So we only characterize whether or not an opossum crossed, whether or not it went in and went out, or how it interacted with the crossing. We didn't have video cameras set up at our crossings, so we couldn't characterize if they were feeding or something like that. But generally, we did find that in lower noise areas, they were more willing to go all the way through the crossing than to not do that. So we had characterized a more successful crossing event as it went all the way through, was the most successful, went in and out, that's next, and then it didn't go into the crossing, that was the lowest. And there was a higher probability of them going all the way through than any of the other categories when it was less loud, less noisy.
So you talked about vegetation as sound absorbing. Do you know if the efforts here or in one more broadly will experimenting with sound absorbing materials on underpasses?
To my knowledge, oh yes, the question was if there's any other mitigation that we can do for noise at wildlife crossings. To my knowledge, I think the only project that I know about is the Wallace-Annenberg crossing in California. I think, yeah, I was going to say Beth can definitely talk more about that. And I know that they're actively engineering noise mitigation at that crossing, but I don't know of very many other projects that are considering vehicle noise in their crossing mitigation. I might be wrong. I don't know everything, so. Yes.
Just the one bridge near the example that you said the road noise is as loud as at the top.
Yep.
For that structure, down that for when it's coming off. Do you have any perception of that? Something we talked about in terms of lowering the sound of certain areas.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a good question. So the question was, at our bridge wildlife crossing, was some of the sound potentially going through the bridge itself versus, or how the sound was getting into the wildlife crossing? So just based on, so we had set our acoustic devices inside in the middle of the crossing as well as on the outside, and there wasn't much difference in the actual noise between the outside and the inside. So I think that it's most likely that the sound is going from the outside through all the way through the crossing, just from both sides, rather than going through the bridge, because the bridge crossing in our area doesn't have very many like gaps or anything. So there's not many places for the sound to actually go through the asphalt into the crossing. So most likely the source has to go through the entrance. But that would be something that would be worth looking at other crossings where there might be more open areas in that bridge.